fact sheet, and I'm going to go into some of these chapters. So the first is on reuse, which is the theme of today, but also creating providers of data intermediation services could be an important tool, and encouraging the sharing of data for altruistic purposes is also an important tool, and that resonates with what has been said about public interest, sharing health data, and creating or at least encouraging use of health data taken broadly to improve mankind or person-kind. Now, the first chapter is actually, it is building on the Open Data Directive, but it is creating structures in member states to force public authorities to open their data as much as they can. So it's basically obliging them to go for a paradigm shift, government keeping its data as much as it could, not sharing it, not seeing any economic benefit at all, and not seeing some benefit for itself, so it doesn't serve its own agenda. That's what the Data Governance Act really wants to do by setting up a lot of structures that might not deliver, but the fact that they're there is planting the seed to break this culture of opacity amongst many state organizations. And the Data Governance Act doesn't want to create any exception to the GDPR, but it also wants to respect trade secrets and intellectual property rights and God knows what else, national security sensitive issues. But and then it says, but if you can do it, and if you can safeguards, and what does chapter 2 say? It explains how this should be done. Safeguards are anonymization, pseudonymization. That doesn't surprise anybody. But interesting is it is setting up, it is talking about fees. Fees can be imposed if private actors and others ask governmental data, but they should be reasonable and only covering the cost of making that data available and secure. And it sets up competent bodies to assist public sector. So the dummies needed to be helped. So we create more state to inform state authorities that they should share. So this is a typical Western European answer. You want something, create more state. Well, we're doing that. Competent national bodies to help national authorities to share. And then there would be a national single information point. So if you want to have data, you can turn to that point and say, where is it? And you get it. And there will be a European access point. All that sounds beautiful, without cynicism. And then it defines these intermediation services that are there to establish commercial relationships for data sharing between data users and a number of individuals or companies. So this is creating an interface that will that will allow the valorization of all kinds of data. But these interfaces need to gain our trust, and that's what this chapter wants to do, complete, including supervision. Who are those interfaces? Can we trust them? Including logos and including a register to recognize them. Yeah. So, and in a recent evaluation document, the philosophical roots or were mentioned for that chapter. It goes back to organizations and writings on data marketplaces, on ecosystems, on data pooling, on data cooperatives, on a personal data wallet or cloud service. Either you're left, green, anarchist, or right, one of those ideas will please you and is an invitation to explore that chapter on these intermediary services. And I like the conceptual flexibility of the founding fathers of that act, because it can even be open to other business formats or mechanisms. So it's conceptually a very rich approach, very fuzzy, but very complete in its openness. Yeah. So I kind of like, that was the reason I wanted to read that document. And then there is data altruism that has been advocated in the previous panels. So it is creating a safe ecosystem where we can consent to use of our data for the public interest. Yeah. But the document rightly underlines that nobody knows what the general interest is, and that member states have different ideas about that. So that is a very wise, but I don't know what that means. It is wise, but in its wisdom, it doesn't inform us about the consequences of how this Data Act is going to be used. So key provisions, again, we don't want fake or abusive data altruists, so-called altruist organizations, so more state, more competent authorities to supervise whoever is calling themselves a data altruistic organization, and logos and a register, a very classical bureaucratic approach as we have in food, air, and just about everything law. So, and there will be a European consent form also. Now, that is interesting. A lot of competent authorities there, at least two, one for the one chapter on the intermediation services and one for the data altruist organization. Can be more. And we have a right to complain, and these bodies need to help us, and we have a right to remedy against decisions of those bodies that we don't like. Now, I'm going to speed up because I get really, there's a European Innovation Board also, and I'm going to say a lot about it. It is now full with data protection people, and we have to say that's perhaps the wrong move, because the Data Act is not taking up, because data protection people are not going to release the brakes. I'll come back to that. But so that is interesting. So there is now a first review of the consequences of the tangible results. It's on the internet. It says it is very, there's a lot of triumph in this, but it's actually very meager. And part of it is that many member states have still not implemented this, the practical aspects of this regulation, and setting up the competent authorities and so on. Belgium has only done that last week. So it is not really a rocket piece of law, but for my opinion, that is not a criticism in itself. It is very visionary, and slow has its beauty, as the Italian kitchen proves day in, day out. So, and there will be a review, and that will be interesting, will be next year, so we can really assess the DGA next year. And there are three items that minimally need to be covered in that review process, and I underline them. So that's all good, and that's what I liked about the regulatory machine of the EU. Now, I talked with a lot of people, juniors in this project, and I'm going to name three of them. Fatma helped me understanding how this first chapter on these public sector bodies is not really picking up, because these public sector bodies that should make this possible have no real incentive, but a lot of risks when creating data flows from the public sector to the private sector. So there is the question is, can this ever work? It should be rendered more concrete. Who of the national authorities will take the risks of doing what the DGA wants them to do? And if they take too many risks, will they become joint controllers, and are they liable under the GDPR? All these kinds of questions. So there's a lot of qualitative assessment to be made when applying the DGA in the light of all these taboo categories of data: intellectual property rights, trade secrets, national security, personal data of the GDPR. And so knowing bureaucrats, and I say this gently, they are not risk takers. But perhaps these novel ideas need some risk taking, need a bigger bubble, a sandbox, but it isn't there. And then the fact that it's not working is the European Health Data Space Regulation. Everybody calls it already the regulation. There's an agreement. I haven't listened it, but for 2 years, everybody called this damn thing the regulation, as if it existed already. This is, of course, a result from the COVID tunnel vision that something needs to be done with health data, and voluntary basis, bottom-up initiatives. No good, no good. Top-down, if not, Europe cannot protect the health of its citizens, and that is the European Health Data Space with the regulation that makes it coercive. So it's a top-down thing that basically does not respect the logic of the DGA, which was a bottom-up logic, and therefore a very beautiful one, in my opinion. But so we heard the previous speakers, that is a debate in itself, but I just wanted to put that on the table. the beautiful bottom-up things doesn't seem to work really well yet. And there's impatience of the regulators, so top-down, something that continental Europe is very good in, enlightened lawmaker. That goes back to the Fredericks of the Prussian state, I guess. They decide what is good and what should happen with our data and overrule consent if needed. So that is the European thing. Further thoughts. So be nice to the Data Governance Act. It's not fully around in terms of implementation. It was launched with care in the heydays of the GDPR, and the composition of the European board with regard to the Data Act is full with enforcement authorities of all kinds, including data protection. And I don't know whether enforcers are the right people to be visionary. Yeah. So there. So that is a message that I got from the EU people that I contacted. If this thing needs to pick up, and if we want that open data, secondary use, and so on, perhaps thinking about a different kind of board, be it ethical or whatever. Yeah. So some of the ideas are certainly open for regulatory improvement. So constructive analysis is not illegitimate. Voila. But we have a problem that we saw this morning with the normative foundations, data as a commodity versus data as a right. These things play in the background. And now I want to know from Giovanni how much time I've left.
4 minutes.
4 minutes. So I'm going to talk about two things. The previous panel talked about overlaps, a lot of authorities that have to collaborate and enforce all kinds of rules. The DGAs doesn't seem to help. It's adding more competent authorities that have to be independent, by the way. And we hear a lot of anxiety amongst data protection authorities about their own privileged scope, their own privileged garden that now has to be shared broadly by others. So what can be done? I'm going to go through. I wrote a book on why do all these acts look like the GDPR and what is behind it. So, and I coined really ugly terms like activication, GDPR mimesis, and regulatory brutality, because these highly well-paid bureaucrats in Brussels do not like ugly terms regarding their work. So I thought, let's do that. But then I become very gentle, and I even defend a lot of the post-GDPR agenda, by the way. Now, I go through my own work. Taking part in this alarm about plurality of enforcers is Draghi. The term overlap has been used 24 times. So my first idea, my first observation is, let's not get carried away by fears about enforcement overlap. Yeah, that was Draghi, for instance. But many academics have that too. And there's a forthcoming article where I consult accountability literature, and that literature is quite straightforward. There's nothing wrong with overlapping accountability mechanisms. It's just a way of being a realist and dealing with it, but it can actually strengthen all guarantees that the citizen wants. And if one authority sleeps, another one might be awake, and so on. So there's a lot to be said. So we have what's happened in the DMA, a clause to organize deliberation. We had the meta judgment. I think two important facts showing us that the way forward is not to carry too much about overlapping competences, but using them for the best. And that's what we're going to need. The amount of study that the competition authority mentioned in the previous panel is impressive. And I'd rather have this being done by all these authorities without losing in on certain interests. So it might be that competition law and data protection law are not in harmony all the time, and so on. But so that is something that science can do. It can calm the alarm. And then the second one is this reconciling the innovation aspect and the protection aspect. And that's not going to be easy. As I said, at the level of fundamental rights, we have two strong rights. And the European Court of Justice has one time said in Google that, and that was explained in the previous panel, give priority to the fundamental right of data protection, disregarding economic interest, but it has never repeated itself. So this opens a lot of research questions for scholars. Now, I want to say something about that and then finish. I think the GDPR is an exceptionally instrument in the long sequence of digital acts that we're seeing. And that has to do with critical junctures, the Snowden revelations, creating coalitions between partners that usually balance out each other. So there was an enormous consensus in 2012 to do something about American abuses and against the big tech. And so the GDPR is set to have a very high standard. And that might be true, although I see many exceptions, as I just proved with research. But it is nevertheless an unconventional high standard setting instrument. And for me, all post-GDPR laws are going to water down that standard in one way or another, in light of the practical agendas of the many DGs and the many societal challenges that they have to deal with. And that's inevitable in a certain way. But I hope it will be done in a very transparent way. So if you coordinate and you'd water down, say it. Yeah. And don't play with public interest concepts and flu. And that's what and the DGs are now launching their watering down instruments in a very wild way. And I miss an organic encyclopedian enlightenment harmonization of all these acts. Yeah. And so in the group of LeADS, I found many inspiration for understanding these tensions in Barbara da Rosa Lazarotta's work and also in Antjes Hinrich's work, but I guess this PowerPoint will be free for use and then you can go further. But I learned a lot from this project. Thank you, Giovanni. As a data protection tunnel-minded person, I had to open up, and I have to say I enjoyed the torture. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Paul. Always listening to you makes me regret why I'm not making a speech right after you. But unfortunately, I don't have the time. So maybe in the question or maybe tonight over dinner, we can go on several topics. So I immediately switch to the next speaker since we have a quite tight timeline. I already introduced Regina. Are you talking from here or from there? Your preference? Whatever. Your preference? Yeah, I mean, either we bring the keyboard here or you can go there. Okay. All right. I do expect that some reaction for what Paul said is coming from Regina. I have the feeling.
Well, in the first place, I would say Giovanni grossly exaggerated any of my knowledge on GDPR, but
You show it.
you're just kind. Thank you. So what I want to do with you today is to lead you through a very practical exercise of legal compliance. In this case here about information requirements when it comes to secondary use of, and that's indeed my focus, electronic health data. So a lot of the examples now are all from the health context. Reason is, as Giovanni already mentioned, I'm engaged in the sharing or the planned sharing of genomic data across Europe. So quite a challenge, and that is why we look into all the aspects of doing that in a legally compliant way. So yeah, how do we actually have compliant information provision? That's what we want to look into. But before doing that, I would like to take a step back. So who actually makes health data available for secondary use? Well, I think virtually all the EU member states have some kind of disease registries in healthcare. And these are for policy making, these are for monitoring in the healthcare sector, but these are almost always also to be used for research. Hospitals make their data available for secondary use. There's dedicated biobanks, which not only have biosamples, but also accompanying data that they share, health data that they share. There are dedicated so-called permit authorities. So authorities that have a legal mandate by law that they can make data available from other stakeholders, typically. And there's also within research stakeholders often also have so-called data repositories, research data repositories that they can use for secondary use. And I have always given some examples here. For example, in Austria, they have in their legislation dedicated which stakeholders, research stakeholders could actually make their data available also for secondary use. So this is kind of a bit of the landscape that we're looking into. And then I went through some of these stakeholders and looked into how are they actually informing about when they make data available for secondary use. What are the projects? What are they using for? Are they disclosing? Who are they? How are they informing? Who are they informing? And I could find in Finland, for example, it's fairly brief. Then I saw in France, this is both are these permit authorities. In France, you can see it's even twofold, so it's much longer and not just what I've shown here, but you can see that we have here an entire list of different aspects, and we were just on the very first item of these. So very different approaches. Then in Germany, there's a biobank PopGen, where it's very brief, and I could some, like in Norway, I couldn't find anything on what research was actually done with the data. So just to summarize the findings, it's very heterogeneous what you find in terms of information provision when it comes to secondary use for research. And yeah, some provide no information at all. Some provide, I think that was the PopGen one, they just provide information on request. What I found most was that there's a brief summary on the project on the web page. And only in one case I found really detailed information, as it is in principle required by the GDPR. But what I found nowhere is that individual information provision is done. So people are not proactively being informed, look, your data will be used in the following research project. It's only just put on the web, our data is used in the following project. And that brings me to the legal view of it. So how should it be according to compliance? The relevant articles for that are Article 13 and 14 in the GDPR. Article 13 is where data are collected directly from the data subject. Article 14 is where you find data from a different source. And that both articles say that information is required in case of secondary use for each new purpose. For each new purpose, you need to inform, and these articles are about informing the data subject. So not about putting information on the web, but about informing data subjects. There are exemptions to this. One is if this is already known to the data subject, which of course will not be the case. And that is only in Article 14, when it's impossible or a disproportionate effort to inform. Then the controller has to take appropriate measures to still protect the rights and freedom of the data subject, but it would not be necessary to inform each data subject individually. There's also the possibility that the disclosure is expressly laid down by union or member states law. And then again, the appropriate measures for informing have to be explained and taken care of in that legislation. Secrecy obligations are not so relevant here for secondary use. So this is the situation we're faced with. Now, disproportionate effort seems to be the one that everyone is using here. And now let's look into concrete examples. The hospital. Well, the hospital typically actually collects the data directly from the patients. That means they cannot rely on any exemption under Article 14 because they fall under Article 13. They have obtained the data directly from their patients. So whenever they process data for a new purpose, they will have to inform, unless the patients know. So let's have a disease repository, disease registry. These disease repositories, when they make data available for secondary use, when they support policy development, they do not need the identity of the individual data subjects. They do not need any contact data because they're just compiling statistics. They make data available. And under Article 11 of the GDPR, it says, well, a controller is not obliged to process identity data just for the sole reason of data subjects' rights. And that means these entities do not collect this information. They receive data in a pseudonymized format. So that means all the direct identifiers have been removed and been replaced by just a code, where the code can, through a certain mapping of keys, be led back to the identity of the people. But they don't have the identity, and it can be a major effort to reestablish, kind of go back from this code to the actual identity. And that can be a major effort depending on who did this pseudonymization, so this swapping of identity against code, and how it was done. There's even some ways where you can just go one way, but not back. All these possibilities. So as most of these disease repositories do not have access to the pseudonymization key, not to the contact data, it can actually even be claimed either an impossibility or at minimum a disproportionate effort. But then Article 14, this derogation, still says the controller has to come up with appropriate measures to protect the data subject's rights and freedoms and legitimate interests. That means the essence that the controller still must try to inform the data subjects is to be taken into account. And just publishing publicly on the web may not be enough, because this always requires the data subjects to actually actively find out, is something happening? They don't see this naturally. And the idea, when it was suggested also in that article, that making it public on the web, that is more when people are working on that web page, for example, and then you can find it. They say, for example, make it public in the public kind of location where people are passing through, so they can find it. So it's not enough to just say, oh, it says public, make it public on the web, that's enough. No, you still need to consider, how likely is it that the data subjects really know that I'm doing this? And if you come to the conclusion that they're not likely to find this out, then you have a serious problem. And if we speak here, for example, of population level data, and increasingly, as we heard, data spaces, data are being made available from the entire population. So how on earth do I know where my data were used? There's a list of 100 projects at some point. And I need to read all these projects to see, are these my data as well or not? It's really, in my view, it shifts a disproportionate burden to the data subjects, because the data subjects are now the one who need to go on all these different web pages, read to all the different projects that are there, and with a maybe even if the full information as required in the article and not as given in a few short sentences, but even then, it's very difficult for me to find out where my data are used. So I would say this has problems to be seen as complying with the GDPR. So then the question is, the other option for a derogation was, well, when information is provided in the law, that could be sufficient. And now I would like to lead you in the European health data space. It's admittedly a regulation which is not yet adopted, but that regulation, or the draft that was published and the agreement that we had, that lists in Article 34 what type of secondary use can actually be done, and has a very long list with lots of explanations and examples. It also lists categories of data that can be used, the recipients, but it still is a principal scope. It's categories of purposes, it's categories of recipients, and that is not enough. And it's always interesting, by the way, I would really strongly recommend you to look into case law of the European Court of Justice. The European Court of Justice does a beautiful job of trying to come up with a consistent interpretation of EU law. And it's very useful to read through these exercises. And one of these cases said, for example, well, or actually it's quoted through lots of decisions. The information requirement is directly related to the rights of data subjects. So, for example, to object. if you don't know that your data are being processed, you are kind of robbed of your right to say no. And this right to say no is important. And that means it's really important, and that's the next one, the information that is provided to you should allow you to understand if that processing is kind of lawful at all, if it's agreeing with your point of view. And that means you need to be actively informed and in detail. And that's why in the same ruling it said, well, for example, where data are being exchanged between public sector bodies, well, if the purpose and the type of data for the transfer between different entities in the public sector, if they are not part of the law, then these public bodies must provide the information to the data subject, and they must provide them in advance for you to exercise your right to object. So even if it's within the government, for example, not even individual different legal entities, if it's within the government, but still from one entity that processes data for a certain purpose to another entity, body in the government that wants to process them for something else, information will be needed unless the law really makes it clear which data, which recipient, which purpose, which the EHDS does not fulfill. We have one more option we could try and explore. We have in the GDPR in Article 23 that data subjects' rights can be restricted under certain conditions. And that means also the right to be informed could be restricted. That was actually exercised or tried to be exercised, again, in the European health data space. The original proposal in the EHDS tried to build on Article 23 and said, well, health data access bodies, so that is the data permit authority in the European health data space, they shall not be obliged to provide the specific information under Article 14 of the GDPR to each natural person, but they shall provide general public information and all the data permits. So that is a bit this idea that is currently pursued by most of the cases. The European Data Protection Board at the time, together with the European Data Protection Supervisor, in their opinion on the regulation, the draft regulation of the European health data space, already expressed serious doubts about the necessity and proportionality of that. And I can tell you the good news, indeed, this paragraph did not survive the negotiations. And I can provide you the background, why not? Well, if we look into Article 23 of the GDPR, the restriction for that right must respect the essence of the fundamental rights and freedoms and is a necessary and proportionate measure in a democratic society. I'm very glad we live in a democratic society and it didn't survive, because the conditions to derogate by law from fundamental rights is, for example, and again, I like to quote the European Court of Justice, the reasons for a limitation of fundamental rights must be directly related to the protection of an interest referred to in Article 23(1). So it has a whole list, such as public health and so on and so forth, but it must be directly related. And if you overwrite this right to be informed, it's not that you cannot pursue secondary use otherwise. You can. It's just a lot of effort to do it. But it's not that it becomes impossible. So it's not safeguarding public health. It's not safeguarding scientific research. No, it's just making the life easier for a public authority. And then again, and that brings me to the proportionality. If it's just about, saving money, costs in the public sector, then again, the European Court of Justice said, well, the lack of resources, there's no legitimate ground to interfere with fundamental rights guaranteed in the Charter of Fundamental Rights of the EU. And that's why this provision would have been non-compliant. But then the question is, how detailed do we actually have to inform? Is it okay if we say it's used for health research? Is it we use it for cancer research, or is it indeed project XYZ with the following? Well, I think you got it already from my previous discussions. Yes, each project is a different purpose. And that means the specific one, well, the background, and we had lots of discussions about that as well. How do we define actually a purpose? And the specific purpose always must allow you to assess which processing is necessary to achieve this purpose, and if data minimization is observed. Again, European Court of Justice. And that means, of course, for each research project, it's different what kind of processing takes place. One uses machine learning, another one just statistics, one uses genetic data, another one just health data. We don't know. So only on the level of the individual project, we can say, what is the specific purpose? But the same applies then also to this permit authority that releases the data for that project, because that is a step. Yes, they make data available for secondary use for health research, for example. But again, the data that they can lawfully release, data minimization, is directly related to the project. And that means each disclosure for a research project is taking place under a different purpose. It is support of the project XYZ on cancer research with the following question, needing the following data. So the conclusion of this exercise is in data provision for secondary use, the data holder, so the one who makes data available to someone else for that someone else's research project, needs to inform the individual data subject about each research project in advance to the disclosure to allow people to object, and indeed giving them sufficient time to do this. And now lots of people come with a big outcry and say, nobody wants to have this information. This is just leading to an information overflow. Well, in the first place, who wants all this information? Quite many. There's a study, and I have here the publication. I hope when the slides are shared, you can follow it up. But that was on the secondary use of genomic data and the patient's decision, at the point of testing, what do they want? 1,500 patients, and 89% of the respondents said they want to have ongoing control about the use of their data. They want to have the possibility to say no to individual research projects. And that's, for me, the answer, that the information obligations of the GDPR are there for good reasons. There are people who want to know. There may be some or many who don't want to know. But even if it's many who don't want to know, that doesn't mean we should overwrite the wishes of those who want to know. And how do we do that? Well, again, GDPR, we have Article 25, which is about data protection by design and default. And data protection by design means we need to aim at a legally compliant information provision, which at the same time avoids information fatigue, because a lot of data protection is done with the wrong premise. It's done and it's leading us to, complete overflow of information, uninteresting information. We don't understand it. No, we need to plan it from the beginning so that it works. And we need to make this effort to inform those people who want to be informed, including of not bothering the ones who don't want to be bothered. And we can do that. We have a proposal, and that is something we developed in our 1 Million Genome Initiative. We suggest that this information should be made available in a portal. And that portal can be configured by the people according to their own choice. And countries may build on portals that already exist. They may build their own. Ideally, there should be one for the country where people find all the information they need. And it's not rocket science. I think we are there already, and it happens everywhere. I mean, the necessary information that needs to be made available, it has to be collected anyway by the controller. The controller has this information. So all they need is an API. So basically an interface to their own information management to make it available in a specific portal for the data subjects. And this portal is passive. So it receives the information, but then it allows an active notification of the people. Hello, there's a new entry. And then people can set the rules if they want to receive this notification or not. But it's the people who set it, and we don't set it for them. And people can also choose what are they informed about. They don't want the full legal list, but what is of interest, they can choose. And people can themselves provide and maintain their contact data, because that's often something where people say, you know, collecting the data, we cannot keep it up to date. But I think we're all used to it now, that when we change our email address, when we change our phone numbers, there's lots and lots and lots of portals which we use where we need to update this. So we just add another one on our list where we need to do that once we change our email address. But there's no rocket science behind this. So the design features of this is basically there will be a preferred choice of notification, an email, a text message. People can choose. I want to have a text message on my phone. I want to have an email. As long as it's a secure information, it's fine. People can choose the time point of notification immediately or aggregated statistics once a week, once a month, whatever. They can set criteria for the choice. So I only want to be informed immediately if it's a commercial company wanting to have my data. I want to be immediately informed if the government wants to use my data for policy making. I immediately want to be informed if it's my health data, but I don't care so much if it's my tax declaration. All this should be configurable for the people. So the portal itself then can kind of group projects, for example, how the people want. I want to know the projects by where do my data come from. For example, my health record separately to whatever my data where I was participating in research. We can give information with a layered structure. So we have links, we have top level information, and we have links, and people can even structure that hopefully a bit themselves. So there's top level information, what people really are interested in. So all this can be configured, and we would like to talk to the people. What kind of options do you want to have? Because if we have too many options, we are also losing people. So you can over design things, and we want to talk to them what they like, but they can also even exercise their rights through the portal. They can say, oh no, I object. And it's much easier to object through the portal, clicking a button, than to have to phone someone to send a message to someone. You can just do it. You read it and you say, oh no, not this one. They can request information. They can ask for a copy of their data all through the portal. They can even say, well, I've got enough. I don't want my data to be used for research in the future. And I say, take me out. It could all happen through the portal. And another one for data protection by design and default, and I would like to briefly go on that as well, is also the technical element. So I think legal compliance is one thing, but we need to translate legal compliance also in practical data security compliance. And one is, for example, we would never communicate direct identifiers. Contact data must be kept separate from the actual information in the portal, because if the portal gets hacked, people may find, the list of projects where your data are used, but they don't find your name next to it. So this is always then disconnected. The messages would just say you have a new entry, maybe in which area, but it never says what it's about, because these communication can be intercepted. And data should be, information should be encrypted, and so on and so forth. So there's a whole list of these technical and organizational measures that we can do, and that should be done when you design such a portal. But in principle, it provides us with a win-win situation. The data subjects can be informed if they want to be informed. They can be informed the way they want to be informed. And at the same time, so 1+MG, that's our 1 million genome initiative. When we implement such a portal, we can fulfill our full information obligation as a controller. And then it's down to the people, like on the web. It's down to us if we read the privacy notice, yes or no. And that way we could do that as well. This portal would provide us with a kind of bidirectional communication tool, exercising rights. We can also send messages to them if they want to receive additional information. So as such, we felt this is a way of becoming compliant for secondary use in a way that is not even exaggerated, expensive, too difficult. It requires pre-investment, but once it's done, it should be easy to maintain. And this is the kind of exercise I wanted to lead you through. If you consider the requirements from the beginning, you can come up with good solutions. And I would like you also to become creative in your job to find good and new solutions. And then I would like to give credit to a lot of people. We have an ethics, legal, social issues working group that largely contributed to this work. In Luxembourg, we have a GDPR working group who helped us with the design. And then the people in my team who helped as well. And of course, we've received funding from the European Commission for this work. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Regina. As you saw, I mean, the first two panelists are basically very strictly interrelated, and they don't know, you don't know, but they're very basically setting the table for even the next panel at the same time. I refrain from any comment. I have a lot of comments, as you can imagine. I immediately give the floor to our third panelist, since we are short in time, and I would like to understand. Okay. Are you present from there or from? Maybe from you wish.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for having me as a representative of the Data Protection Authority in the scientific community. It's excellent occasion for me, because usually we are in a different Bibles, and usually we don't talk each other, not only with competition authorities, but also between authorities and scientific worlds. It's important to talk each other, and thank you very much for this initiative. As regards the last presentation, let's stress to one important thing. Thank you very much, Regina, for this detailed schedule, itinerary. What should we do during our activity? Because transparency is one of the most important things, and we know from the practice that usually organizations, but also scientific community has problem with the implementation. And this is a challenge, how to do this communication in the way which is appropriate for the target group. And this is the lack of scientific researchers in this field in Europe. Why? Are really looking for any researchers how to communicate in the terms of data protection communication. I know researchers from the US and other parts of the world. Unfortunately, we have very strong legislation in Europe, but we don't have enough researchers in this area. I'm wrong, Paul? We have? No, we don't have enough for me. Okay, as Paul mentioned before, it's something like watering down of the fundamental rights protection after GDPR area. I'm representing Data Protection Authority, and of course, I'm in favor of fundamental right to data protection. And please understand my positions during the presentation. As Paul mentioned during the first presentation, GDPR recognizes scientific researches as an important issue, such societal issue, which should be also taken into account in the context of the processing of personal data. You have several references and several references in the preamble and in the normative body of GDPR, where we can see some kind of privileges, examples of special treatment of processing of personal data for scientific research purposes. Of course, we can take into account the general consideration about the scientific advancement, promotion of scientific research, and of course, the establishment of the European research area. What else? In several places in GDPR, we have references to the national legislation, member states' legislation, especially in the context of Article 89, which provides for guarantees, but also exemptions from several obligations on the basis of the member states' law. We also have references to the member states' law in Article 6 or Article 9 in the context of legal basis. And from the perspective of the creation of the European research area, I think it's one of the main problems that we have several national legislation, pieces of national legislation, which varies from country to country. It's not exactly the GDPR problem, but problems connected with models and specific regulations adopted on the national level, which can be treated as some concerns in the context of the practice in researches. From the GDPR perspective, important question is, what does it mean scientific research? Or what does it mean scientific research purposes? Of course, lawyers usually want to clarify and define things. However, in GDPR, we don't have any specific definitions of that, and we can take into account other possible definitions. You can see some hints adopted, some hints provided by the European Data Protection Board. We can see such activities which are carried out with relevant sector-related methodological and ethical standards in general, in conformity with good practice. In recital 159, we can see that European legislator explains that the scientific research is rather broader concept under the GDPR. We can see that this is the research carried out by the in the context of fundamental research, applied research, but also privately funded research. What does it mean from the perspective of application of these specific provisions connected to scientific research? It means that we have within this area academic researchers, not-for-profit organizations, governmental organizations, but also commercial companies, because the term is rather wide. But from the data protection perspective, we should provide some limitations in order to differentiate between scientific researchers and purely commercial activities. Of course, we should take into account that sometimes the blurred area between both areas. What is the limitation which we can propose? The first one is that the primary goal should be conducting scientific research, even if it's funded by the private company or private organization, commercial organization. And the second one, the research activity should not only be oriented towards commercial interest. It means that we can see more general interest in the context of the specific research. This limitation is important because, as I mentioned several times, GDPR provides some kind of flexibilities, exemptions, and some kind of special treatment in the context of processing of personal data for scientific research purposes. All processing operations in this context should be in line with Article 89 GDPR, which provides for special safeguards which should be adopted and should be provided in the context of in the context of scientific research. Of course, the same article in paragraph 2 provides this possibility for exemptions under the union or member states law. In practice, this is the member states law under several conditions. This is important. First of all, it doesn't mean that the whole GDPR can be exempted. I remember such discussions with scientific community in Poland. And it doesn't mean that most of the principles can be exempted. We have only specific articles, and it's important justification of such exemptions. Of course, another layer of the exemptions of the GDPR is any possibility to adopt legislation which can modify general rules in line with Article 23 of GDPR, which provides conditions for such exemption with safeguards, with conditions and safeguards which should be in place under the national legislation. One of the most important principles under the GDPR in Article 5 is purpose limitation principle, which is important in the context of the topic of the panel, secondary use of data. In the principles, personal data shall be collected for specified, explicit, and legitimate purposes, and not further processed in the manner that is incompatible with those purposes. This is the principle. In this context, we should differentiate between primary processing operations, initial processing, and further processing for another purposes, which is important in the context of our discussion, in the context of scientific activity. The first example is a situation where the collection and processing, including collection of personal data by a data controller for specific scientific research purpose. It's important that this purpose should be specific, as I mentioned, it was mentioned before, in the specific research purpose, not in general scientific research purposes. This is important. The purpose should be specific, enough specific in the context of the researchers or planning researchers. Further processing is the situation where the data controller wants to process the personal data for another specific scientific research purpose. Of course, at the beginning, it was collected for the specific scientific research purpose, and after the research, after the project, data can be collected for other purposes, other projects. In several situations, we have the situation where the data controller initially collects data for another purpose, not connected with the scientific purposes. And this is the situation where the further processing means that the data controller intends to process the personal data for scientific research purposes. From the scientific organization, especially in the context of the implementation of Digital Data Governance Act and other pieces of legislation where we have intermediaries, data intermediaries, and new models for giving access to public data and the creation of the secure spaces for data, which can be good sources for researchers. It's important that from the perspective of the scientific organization or scientist, researcher, who collect the data from such sources, for him as a data controller or for this organization as a data controller, the scientific research purpose is treated as a primary purpose. Of course, now it's not clear, but it's important in the context of the purpose limitation principle and the special presumption of compatibility in the context of the purpose. The same Article 5, paragraph 1, letter B, provides that further processing for the scientific research purposes in accordance with the mentioned Article 89. It means with these conditions and safeguards in place, not be considered to be incompatible with the initial purpose. It means that this data can be further processed for the scientific research purposes, as recital 50 explains. This situation also can be treated as a legal basis, as exemptions from the need to collect, to find new legal basis for such processing for the scientific research purposes. Of course, this recital is controversial for me personally, and I think that this recital is from the first draft of GDPR, where the idea for the presumption of compatibility was a little bit different. However, this idea that the data can be collected for the purposes compatible with the initial purpose can be allowed on the legal basis which were in place at the first stage of the processing of personal data, has been accepted by the European Data Protection Board in the context of the implementation of clinical trials regulation. However, with some limitations. In this context, it's important to see legal basis for processing of personal data, for the initial processing of personal data in the context of the research activities, and also further processing of personal data for the other scientific purposes. Article 6 of GDPR provides legal basis for processing of personal data. Traditionally, we think about consent in this context, because from the scientific world, we usually think about the consent, but consent for the person who wants to take part in the research project. It's important to differentiate between these concepts. First of all, from the perspective of data protection, probably the consent of data subject is not favorable in the context of researches. I know that the scientific community usually think mainly about consent, but it doesn't mean that consent is not required, but not consent for the processing of personal data, but acceptance to be part of the project, acceptance to be part of the research. Why it's important? Because we don't really need to duplicate concepts in this context. In several situations, the more appropriate legal basis will be, for example, public interest or legitimate interest. Of course, it depends on the national legislation, and of course, does it mean that consent is avoided in this area, especially in the context of the reuse of data. There are some situations where the consent is required. But what I like to say is that the consent is not the primary legal basis for processing of personal data for scientific research purposes. It's important. I know that there are several disputes when we talk, from the data protection perspective, when we talk with the scientific community. Of course, there are no one common ground which legal basis is more appropriate within the European Union, because even in the documents adopted by the European Data Protection Board, you can see different approaches connected with the different legal framework in member states, in specific member states. It means that when you have projects covering several member states, you need to take into account different approaches in the context. I'm sorry, legalistic question, legalistic issue, but you need to take into account the different approaches in terms of different legal bases for the same processing operations within the project. And unfortunately, I'm so sorry for that, but this is the reason why we have these open clauses within the GDPR, and we have different legislation in place in different member states. As we talk about processing of personal data for scientific research purposes and reuse of data for these scientific research purposes, we need to remember about additional safeguards foreseen in Article 89. It was directly mentioned that these safeguards should ensure rights and freedoms of data subjects. And we think about technical organizational measures, inter alia ensuring principle of data minimization, and two measures are directly indicated in the Article 89. It's anonymization and pseudonymization. And it means that we need more required knowledge and skills in the context how to use methodologies in this situation, because I think it's also the lack of knowledge. It's a general lack of knowledge and problem with some kind of centers of best practices, which can be very effective and can be very useful for this not only scientific but general public, but also public authorities in the context of the giving access to the data. What was mentioned before, another safeguard is enhanced transparency towards research subjects about the use of their personal data. It means it's more just one notice, and we use more appropriate possibilities like layered notices, communication in several stages of the project, which is available for the research team. There are many organizational safeguards, which are typical distribution of tasks, responsibilities within the organization, technical organizational measures in the context of security of data, the use of appropriate software and hardware and infrastructure for the specific researchers, setting up, securing processing environment, and last but not least, privacy enhancing technologies, data protection by design and by default should be implemented within such projects. And let me say one more thing: proper training in data protection for all personnel authorized to process the research data. I mean the researchers, but also other employees involved in the project, which is essential from the perspective of general rules, but also specific obligations connected with the use of data and security. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Piotr, also for remaining perfectly in the timing. We are technically speaking out of the time for the panel, but let me not abuse but profit of my position as a chair. So we will definitely take some questions. I personally have a lot of taboo questions to the panelists, but I will give first preference to the audience. If there are questions, I see already Senji there. And I would suggest that we gather all the questions so that we then give all the answer together. Thanks.
My question is to Regina, and I think it's probably something that you probably get a lot about the current of the available EHCS regulation and maybe the lack of transparency or the lack of role of consent. And I just wanted to get your insight into if you think there will be increased transparency or maybe consent opt-out in any future versions of the European Health Data Space. Hi. So my question is also to Regina. So yeah, I'm the computer scientist here, but I did work on secondary use with Fatma, which is a lawyer. Yeah. So basically, a question is that is if the data like changes form, would you still consider it a secondary use? In a sense, if you feed your data to a model to create an AI model, now the data is gone. You only have the model. Data is somehow encrypted inside, coded inside, but you're not sure. But then you repurpose that model, so you use it for something else. Now, would you still consider that a secondary use of data or not?
About with the new version of the EHS, the Parliament agreement, the point that you mentioned about data subjects' rights is also, I think, in my opinion, is also still not so clear. So what do you think about that? I mean, they, as you mentioned, they excluded that article, but still data subjects' right is like does not mention explicitly. So it's not so clear to me how actually data subjects' rights will going to be applied in the secondary use.
Further question? I think there are no further questions from an audience. I will shoot just one collective taboo. Oh, yeah, there is.
One issue I see with an opt-out system is that if some group feels, for instance, like if some specific group has lower trust towards medical systems, then opting out leads to underrepresentation of that group in research at mass scale. I don't know, is this resolvable somehow? Is there any way to account for this?
Lot of very intriguing questions. My joint, at least I reduced to one taboo question to all of you, basically, because you have been basically building all around the research exception, and I've been publishing quite extensively on research exception. I'm a believer of the research exception, but I must admit that I'm a little bit defeated by the impossibility to actually exploit for good the research exception. And I'm afraid that the boiling down that you are suggesting it might happen, it will just complicate even more the things without boiling down, watering down, nor boiling up anything there. So the taboo question is for all of you. Maybe we experts, I mean, I'm not an expert, you are the expert on data protection, got it entirely wrong with the GDPR. And we have been building some taboos around it. One very simple example is the need to have legal basis for special categories of data under both Article 9 and Article 6 that don't match with each other, which creates immense hurdles with reference to secondary use. And at the same time, probably we don't, okay, I'll stop there. So just otherwise it will be too much. But basically, is it that anyway, other way than waiting for all the attacks on the GDPR, then starting to interpret according to the original spirit of the GDPR as stated in its first article? A question? Oh, okay. Very quickly, because otherwise we don't have the time for the answers.
Thank
Thanks.
you very much for your very, very horizontal presentation. And I'm wondering, and how we create or how we establish a perfect interoperable systems, all the regulation between all the regulation, because we know GDPR, for example, Data Governance Act referred GDPR, and Data Governance Act at the same time referred European Health Data Space, some area. So my research focusing also data altruism organizations. So it is very important for the between data subject and good relationship between data subject and data barons or data collectors. A good relationship and a good balance creates some European Health Data Space Area and GDPR and Data Governance Act. So how we establish and create a good interoperable systems between all horizontal regulations? It's very important because GDPR is here, yes. Data Governance Act is here, yes. And Data Governance Act refers data altruism organizations, yes. And Data Intermediaries Alliance is very important for the secondary use of data area and for the good explicit consent, maybe. So Regina talked about
Let's go to the question, otherwise we don't have time. Yeah.
The secondary use of data, we use the we can use the opt-out systems, but how we balance to the all horizontal regulations is very important.
Thank you very much. Who wants to go first? Of course, the three of you are called into action, so who wants to go first? Oh.
I think there was at CPDP a conference by DPOs, and that gave me a lot of confidence in. So, in the light of your question, DPOs will implement those different acts, and they're situated within an organization. And I think I first want to see how that works, but I think they can be trusted. So I would give it some time, and I would not over-exaggerate outside the academia the problems of small differences and so on. And then understand that vagueness and so on is part of the normal rules of the game of development. So the DGA is interesting because it was launched at us in a very Asian-friendly way with a big smile, but capable of being applied in very different contexts. So, but the wisdom behind the DGA that I would like to advocate is seeking acceptance of the data subjects. And that's why I like your presentation that much. We should demystify the disproportional efforts theory as much as we can. And part of that important task for the future will be done by the DPOs.
Answer all the questions you were asking.
Well, I would like to pick in particular on the questions that you addressed directly to me. I feel with the getting all the different regulations compatible and kind of interacting, I think we are looking forward to a long list of case law for clarification, because we have it already when we discuss also with the Commission. We say, well, it reads like this. Oh, we didn't mean it like this. Well, this is how it reads. Well, let's wait until people interpret it differently. And even like the question of, do we need Article 6 and Article 9 ended in front of the European Court of Justice, Germany asking, if we have Article 9, do we really still need Article 6? Yes, of course we do. It's written there. But so even the less clear, the more clear answers still end up there. So I would say, yeah, lots of these legislations are difficult for us now to interpret. We need to find our own way, and we know how it is already from the GDPR. Every country has their own interpretation. So I'm afraid that's the bit unhappy part we are looking forward to. On the other hand, there is a good intention, even if there were kind of the way to hell is paved with good intentions, but the Commission wants to find the balance between valorizing data and keeping data valorization fair. And I think DGA is largely about fairness, about supporting secondary use. And the EHDS, for example, building then very strongly on both of them, making something real, and we can see the struggle that they're having in implementing that. And that brings me to the EHDS questions. Will there be opt-out? Will there be transparency? The opt-out has been implemented as mandatory for all countries. There's even, and for that, I could kill them. For certain data, such as genetic data, molecular data, countries can again have additional rules, stricter rules, such as requiring consent. But that brings us back to our problem in the GDPR that we have at the moment with Article 9.4. Every country can again have their own solution, and the EHDS was meant to get rid of Article 9.4 of the GDPR. And now we have it back for genetic data. Okay, this is how it happens. But in principle, there will be an opt-out. There is a clause that opt-out may be overwritten where it's in, a strong public interest, important public interest. But that would have to be justified, as it is also in the GDPR, as it is in Article 23 that we were discussing. There can, of course, be reasons, like there's a pandemic, and then we can't have this, sensibility of people on their vaccination data or this or that. We need to have the data. And it's for the entire society that this outweighs the interest of the individual. But they also put it that this needs to be a case by case and needs to be justified, which is different to before when it was done on the category of purposes without proper balancing exercises. So we have the balancing exercise back, which is important. Transparency, in principle, is not mentioned, and that was the other question. A lot of things are not mentioned. Well, the good thing is when things are not mentioned means the GDPR fully applies. And so that helps us. Again, we have different ways of countries interpreting the GDPR, in particular when it comes to transparency, as we can see in the implementations. I mean, the Finn data example that I gave is the Finnish permit authority. That's the Finnish interpretation of the amount of information they need to do, which is not there. So we will have discussions in the context of the EHDS on this interpretation, and it may become better through that as well, because it is now more openly discussed between the countries as well in the different interpretations. But yes, have I? Yeah, there was the question on the opt-out. This is another one that some people, certain groups will tend to opt out of the system, and how do we deal with that? I've got two answers for that. One is that we still have, other legislation or types of legislation we have for research. For example, the UODO Convention, not ratified in all the EU member states, but nevertheless at least signed by most of them. And that says that a natural person, should never be a subject of research against their will. And I think that is something to have in mind when we think about balancing the interest of scientific research as to the interest of the individual. And it also doesn't help research. I mean, yes, these people opt out, but at least you know that they've opted out. So at least in your research, you can consider that. It's much worse if you don't allow people an opt-out. They start to mistrust the system. They don't trust the healthcare professional anymore, for example, in the European health data space. That means the healthcare goes down because the doctor doesn't know crucial information the doctor should know. And at the same time, your data gets wrong, but you don't know that your data are wrong. Missing data is easier to cater for in research than wrong data where you can't find out if data are wrong. So that would be my answer on that one. We need to find ways in research to kind of live with this bias, but this bias has always been there in research, and we can't entirely take it away. We just can find methodologies to overcome it. Data protection by design and default, trying to reach our purposes without interfering with people's rights.
Thanks a lot, Regina. Piotr, final words.
Very short. I think that we have a problem with mistrust in general. And it's especially important in the context of scientific research. So we need to build trust of the public and individuals if we want to do researches in appropriate way for the future, because we should think about building the trust in general. And I hope that this framework, which was adopted within the European Union, is a good basis for that, with the idea that, of course, the justification for this framework, it was building trust of people. Of course, what will be the result, it's another story. It's the first thing. And I think we should remember about it. It's important, and individual autonomy is crucial if we want to build trust within the society. The second one, how to deal with different pieces of legislation. I don't know whether it's easier to hear that not only scientists have a problem with that, how to deal with GDPR, DGA, and other pieces of legislation, because I think that now it's too early, the first. The second, it's a problem for everyone, including public authorities, which are responsible for the implementation. How to navigate between different pieces of legislation. Of course, from the perspective of data protection, it's clear, okay, it's easier because GDPR still applies without prejudice, because it was main concern of data protection authorities that new pieces can, exempt important principles and important obligations. This is one direction of interpretation, but still we need more experiences in general, because I think it's not only the problem of the specific organizations, but still it's a problem of member states, because only in several member states, GDPR, DGA has been implemented finally. It's still, for example, Poland is an example, we don't have yet legislation in place. We can talk about it. Of course, the Polish data protection will be responsible for intermediation services and data altruism. Another issue is, for example, you mentioned altruistic processing of data, that, for example, the DGA doesn't cover all activities in this field. It means my fear is that most of such activities will be outside the DGA, sorry. And because it's easier to do these activities without all these conditions provided, specified by DGA. And the last taboo question. I was involved in the adoption of GDPR. I try to not remember that, but I was involved. I remember these discussions, especially in the council, but also within the parliament. And I think after 6 years of application, that we still need more experiences. This is the reason. Why? Because before GDPR, we had 28 data protection acts with 28 different cultures, different models. Of course, it was based on one directive, but I can say you, even between neighboring countries, the basic concepts were understood in different way. This is very hard work. I can say from the inside the PB work. Sometimes it's hard to try to reach compromise approach, common approach for all member states, because our history, if we had 40 years of experiences connected with national legislation, not always is easy to change that when we talk about European model.
Thank you very much, Piotr.
Giovanni,
Yeah.
I really,
Yeah.
I hope you all listen well. I think I discussed the DGA and I was listening to Regina and I was thinking, this is the DGA. This is chapter 2, huh? But they keep it outside. And I don't have any problems with that. I think that document has an interesting status as a source of inspiration. But when these good initiatives come to the fore, it would be handy if this act applied more easily to these new developments. So that's one thing, a message that I wanted to convey. You can do everything outside the DGA, even in the context of processing activities that are identified as DGA relevant. So that's something for the review of the DGA to think about. and the second thing is that after, when I see your beautiful initiative, do we still need it, the European data health regulation? That is one question. So it shows you the kind of lack of patience out there. Huh? And I hope we can calm the European scene, because it's not a good way forward for me. There's some more to learn from these things that are carefully built by stakeholders and scientists. And once it's ready, you can replace health by any other societal field. And I think it still will be a very valid model of the way forward to manage data protection rights and other interests, because it's a, so I think there's an interesting blueprint of how we can collectively balance out these things, safeguard and empower individuals while allowing new technologies and blah and blah.
Thanks a lot, Paul, for this final consideration. Please join me in thanking this amazing and marvelous panel with all the answers. We are definitely out of time, so I'm abusing my